Explore the history, relationships, expertise, and data that go into ensuring Stine growers get maximum yield potential. This is the Stine Seedcast. Here's your host, David Thompson.
Hello, I'm David Thompson, National Marketing and Sales Director for Stine Seed Company, and this is the Stine Seedcast, a bi-weekly show where Stine growers, agronomists, and other special guests exchange product knowledge, agronomic expertise, and discuss everything that goes into maximizing yield. On today's episode, we're meeting with Warren Stine. Warren is our Assistant Director of Corn Research for Stine Seed Company, and he's going to be talking to us today about something that's very near and dear to our hearts. That's HP Corn, our high population corn initiative. Welcome on the show, Warren.
Thank you, David. Good morning.
One of the things that is an offshoot of the fact that we breed and develop our own corn is that we get to take corn in some new and interesting directions. And one of the things that's come out of that is what we call our HP corn, or high population corn. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about the impetus of that and kind of how it started and, all of that. So I guess for background, what was the origin of HP, or high population corn, as it relates to the corn breeding program?
It was accidental, David. And I'm not kidding.
I think it's a great story.
I am being absolutely serious about that. There's a couple different things that fed into this. But initially, when we were putting plots out in the late 70s, early 1980s, everybody in the industry was doing a thing called end trimming. And the idea was that you'd go to your yield trial plots and you'd have to trim off several inches of them at the front and in the back because you were getting a thing called end row effect that some people wanted to eliminate. Sometimes, just because of the nature of the equipment that was involved at the time, your plots would be not quite uniform. Plots are laid out in a grid system, and you have ranges and rows. And sometimes if you've got a plot planter that's, it's only planting 4 rows at a time, those 4 rows are not going to be quite straight, starting and stopping with rows on either side of them. And so you need to make some adjustment because you get things that'll be cheating. So that's part of it. We planned on doing this end trimming, so you would plant heavier. And then guess what? We didn't do the end trimming. So we had plots that were planted a little thicker than they should have been. And we were seeing data that suggested that, these things that were planted heavier seem to be doing better. And likewise, at some point, and I had some documents on this, I'd go through some old yield trial indexes. The people that would really know what was going on in those indexes are all have passed away now. Jim Mace in the early 1980s in our corn department kind of oversaw our plots and was responsible for making indexes. And his indexes in the 1980s, for what it's worth, were all handwritten. He used a lot of whiteout. But at any rate, occasionally they would have an entry that maybe we had extra seed of, or they were just curious to see what would happen. So they would push the population up a little bit. And at that time in the early 1980s, that meant that maybe we were, going to push it up to 23 or 24,000, just 1 or 2,000 over what the rest of the trial had. But by accident anyway, we came across data that kept telling us that we were seeing a benefit from higher populations. So about 10 years later, if you jump forward, we were intentionally then on a very regular basis taking our elite entries, really top cut stuff, and planting those at different rates, maybe a low rate, a medium rate, and a high rate in our test system to see how is this thing going to work, what works best for it. And we kept seeing that same thing pop up where the high population corn was beating things at the, planted at the lower rate. And so we went from, I don't know if in the 1970s, if we were planting 24,000. When we got into the 80s, we were up to 28,000 on average for a plot, and kept pushing that and pushing that. Right around 2007 or 8, we started experimenting with narrower rows in an effort to get more plants in those plots. At one point, we were in 12-inch rows. Eventually, we settled on twin 20s, did that for a couple of years, and now we've backed off to we're in 15-inch rows, and plots are three rows wide. We've experimented with 2-row plots. We've experimented with 1-row plots, 4-row plots, 6-row plots, and I think we maybe did a little with 8-row plots. But all of this data that we've looked at, it keeps telling us that higher populations are the way to go. Now, that doesn't mean that you want to go crazy high, and we've done experiments where we push things to a 60,000 planting rate, which that is not good. Nobody should be doing that on their farm. That's kind of crazy. Right now, if we plant something at a high rate, we're talking 48,000 is about maximum in our test system. We've continued to do this. This kind of segues into something else. When you put plants in a high density situation, so whether it's narrower rows or closer together within the rows, what you're doing is you're creating stress. You're driving stress that's going to cause, if water is in short supply, it's going to be really in short supply in narrow rows and high density situation. If your hybrid has an issue with lodging, that stress of being packed in there like that is going to aggravate that. Those two things alone have helped us sort through our material and boot out stuff that can't tolerate high stress or potentially a drought scenario. And this also has shortened the heights of our hybrids as we've done this over time. So we currently collect height data on every single hybrid in our test system at multiple locations. So this last year, that means we had 50,000 hybrids, first generation test, and had to collect a plant height on every single one of those hybrids. We started doing that in 1996, and I clearly remember that because I was the guy who was collecting the data that year. But I have gone back through all this data from 1996 to the present, and if I graph it out and you look at our program, we've got a pretty good slope in there from 1996, actually up through about 2017. Once you get to about 2017, we're sort of leveling off and even going up a little bit. Our material is not getting shorter. We appear to be getting a little taller, even though we're still at what I think the rest of the industry would recognize is a pretty high planting rate in our test system. But once again, this drives lodging, so you can throw out things that are going to fall over in the field and should give you some drought tolerance. And drought tolerance, one of the ways that works is that our program keeps throwing things that silk early. When you get in a drought situation, a hybrid, the tendency is for it to try to put all of its energy into that tassel, and we're going to get pollen shed before we have silk emergence in standard hybrids. But our testing system favors an early silking, so that if you do get into that stress situation, you're more likely to just be silking same time you've got pollen shed, as opposed to pollen shed is done before there's any silk emerging on those hybrids. So those are some sort of unique things, some aspects of our program that have come out of this sort of higher density push
Well, and that kind of makes sense. I remember several years ago, I had a grower at a farm show who came up to me and he said, talking about a certain hybrid of ours, and said, I don't know why you guys market this as high population, because I'm planting dry land in Kansas at 18,000, and I planted that hybrid. It did awesome. We had a drought. All my neighbors' corn went barren, but this stuff did a great job. And had to kind of explain that, well, you got the benefit of the stress tolerance related to that. What we call HP, right, is also stress tolerant. Yeah. And I said, that's the part that paid off for you in that particular situation, as opposed to pushing the population and getting, high pop.
Yeah, that is absolutely correct. And so I kind of chuckle to myself. I look at other people in the industry that have hybrids that are supposed to be drought proof, and they've got different methods in their breeding programs for how they got there. But we were out in front of everybody with what we were doing in our testing program, and that the idea wasn't to get drought tolerance, but that's what we got just by pushing populations as we have done in our test.
Well, and mentioning drought reminds me too, one of the things that it seems to come up as we talk about increasing populations, planting populations, is this idea that, well, particularly in areas where you don't irrigate and water may or may not be plentiful, will that acre support, 10% more plants or 15% more plants? And I think, we probably push back a little bit on that, to the idea it's about the green material, right? As opposed to talk a little bit about that idea.
Well, so it's about the amount of biomass you have per acre, or, if you want to say harvest index. And the key thing to keep in mind here is that we've got the shortest hybrids in the industry. And so as an example, we've got a competitor that if I look at their 114-day hybrids, they are a good 20 inches taller than our hybrids at that same maturity. And that extra 20 inches of plant does absolutely nothing for them. They've got a lot of biomass there, but that's not going necessarily into grain production. All you're doing is, it's almost like adding a wick into your field there to wick out more moisture when you've got a taller plant that's, you're just kind of sucking it out of there, giving more opportunity to pull moisture out. We think we've got some added water efficiency there with shorter stuff. You don't need all of that extra plant material there. Another way to look at this is, Dad has one way to look at it, and then I look at it in a different way. But it's in terms of, you've got a factory, and your factory, who cares what it's churning out? Cars, widgets, whatever. Our factory, when you look at a Stine plant, looks a lot smaller than somebody else's factory. But the fact of the matter is that we're going to be turning out the same amount of grain from our factory as our competitors. Why do you want to have all this extra, I think Dad would say, overhead of extra space in your building when you don't need it?
Yeah, because in that scenario, you're paying to heat it, you're paying for the lights, you're paying for all the cost to support that structure.
Yes. So we've got a plant that we're building on all this extra tissue, stalk, leaf, all this stuff that is not necessary to produce the amount of grain we want. Why do you want to put anything into that when you can have a shorter plant, which is consequently going to give you, greater tolerance to lodging, falling over? Why would you do that?
Is there a question, or I should say, is there an answer in here about benefits of high population corn? Why even do that? Why go there? What do you think?
Well, of course, there's the general yield trend that looks like there's a benefit there. Early canopy closure is a very good point. When you are in narrower rows, especially if you're going into a dry year, if you can get a few days extra canopy closure to help hold the moisture you've got down in there, into the canopy, that's a plus. There are some benefits to dealing with erosion, having just more plants out there helping keep that soil in place, whether it's from a wind event or heavy rain. Those extra leaves out there stopping that hard rain from hitting quite so hard and moving your topsoil away. So there are some other things, some incidental pluses.
So you mentioned, one of the things that's happening, I think, in our industry, we've been talking about high population, high density corn for a very, very long time.
Yeah.
And for a long period of time, we were one of just about the only people out there kind of talking about that. More recently, I think it's becoming, I won't say in vogue, but it's becoming more popular to have that conversation, and we have other companies talking about it. What's your take on where the state of higher density corn sits today versus where it was 10 years ago?
Well, one of our competitors just a couple years ago was really touting that they were going to have some short corn coming out, and I don't know where that talk went. I suspect that in their case, maybe it was some genetically modified, something that was going to have a shorter gene in it. Don't know for sure, but I haven't heard so much from those guys, and I'm speculating that's because what they were working on just wasn't working. I think everybody in the industry is aware now that higher populations and shorter plant types is the direction we need to be going in the future. If you do look at height data, which I've got some, and look at some of our competitors' products, yes, they are getting shorter. So I think people in the industry are seeing that's the direction to be going. Certainly Bayer, if I can say that, those people were pretty excited about what they were doing there. And I think they were maybe using a dwarf gene to knock down the height on their material. And I'm just speculating here because I don't know what those folks were really trying to develop there. I don't have any idea. We looked at some dwarf genes because they're naturally occurring. There are several different dwarf genes out there. We tested some dwarf material and saw that, and when I talk about dwarf, I'm talking we can knock your hybrid down to 5 feet, less than 5 feet. We were seeing that we think that many of these dwarf genes give you a dwarf root system.
Okay.
And we were not seeing an ability to tolerate any kind of drought stress whatsoever. Several of those hybrids were pollinating before we had full silk emergence on them. Now, they could still yield. We could get some high yield out of that stuff. But seeing that kind of response in a stress situation scared the heck out of us, and we've eliminated all of that dwarf gene material from our program at this point in time. And that doesn't mean that we won't have some naturally occurring and pop up, segregate out of our pools of stuff. But I think that that's possibly what Bayer may have been working with. And I suspect that they may have discovered the same thing, that, hey, yeah, when you get into a drought situation, this isn't so cool.
And that leads into another, I think, topic that's kind of interesting about this whole thing about high population corn is short corn for the sake of short corn, or is it about the population? What I mean by that is, not all short corn is high pop corn, and not all high pop corn is short, right?
Yeah, right.
So, but again, short plant height is probably the most visible, the most visible attribute, right? And so I think it's the most common thing people refer to, but it's only one component of the process.
Right. And this, one of these things that comes up with height that kind of drives me crazy is we get people that will do a little strip trial on their farm with some of our shorter stuff, and they'll have one of our competitors out there that's quite a bit taller. And we get shaded in a lot of these strip trial situations. And can't get it through to people that you have to be more than 8 30-inch rows wide to start getting usable data in a strip trial situation where you've got one of our short hybrids next to somebody else's tall stuff. And in an 8-row situation like that, I would tell you want to only harvest the center 4 rows to get any accurate data because of that shading effect.
So from the standpoint of if you're a grower and you want to evaluate this idea or this concept and you're going to split the planter, if you're talking about a height differential that's significant, you're really not going to learn anything.
That's right. And they can kind of prove that to themselves if they want to go hand harvest a little bit, go hand harvest both hybrids, take a 17.5-foot section out of the rows where they're right next to each other and calculate your yield on that, right where they're next to each other in competition. And then go take another sample, another 17.5-foot section out kind of in the middle of these and see what the difference is in yield.
So those cases, the differences can be very, very significant, right?
Oh, yeah. It can be 30 or 40 bushel. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. It'll be pretty dramatic.
And the other thing is equipment is changing.
Yes.
I think at the time when we did 12-inch rows, I think that was, a lot of that was custom built. And now today we're in 15s. And I think part of that is because now there are really pretty good 15-inch solutions that maybe didn't exist 8 or 9, 10 years ago. So for farmers, the other part is, none of this happens in a vacuum, right?
Oh, yeah.
And you can say theoretically this all works great, but it also has to work with my farm and how I choose to farm. The good news is a lot of these hybrids that we're dealing with now can still work well in 30-inch row or work in what we so it's not like they have to go to a sub 30-inch row configuration today.
Right.
It still works for them.
Right. Yeah, there's no reason to. We get people that seem to think that to plant Stine corn, you have to be in narrow rows, and that is not the case. We are just evaluating our material that way. We know that it works well that way. We want people to be aware of that if they want to move forward with something like that on their farms. But they work just as well in 30-inch rows as any narrow row configuration.
To talk about where this all came from and what the theory behind it is, I think when we started this conversation, we started about how it originated within our testing program, right? I want to talk in a broader sense about where populations have gone over time. So talking about corn populations, I guess give me a feel for the historical concept of corn planting population in the U.S. over the last, since we've been planting corn.
Yeah. So anybody that Googles with any ability at all, you can actually look at corn yields in the United States from, before 1900 up to the present. You can find USDA graphs. And, you get a pretty sharp climb in places on there. And if folks would sort of overlay on that chart changes in our planting practices, farming practices, you would see that as we've narrowed rows historically from 1900 to the present, that yield gain has come along with this set of changes. So early on, let's say it's like 1910 on your farm here in Iowa. So my grandfather, when he was growing up on our farm here, we planted, it was planted as checked corn. So your corn was planted in a hill, and you'd maybe put 3 kernels in one hill, and it was planted checked so you could cultivate it in multiple different directions because we had no herbicides at the time. And the planting density at that time was maybe 10,000 plants per acre, depending on how good a stand you got out of your stuff. And that's still dealing with open pollinated hybrids. That's the way folks planted open pollinated hybrids for many, many years. Interestingly enough, so as we got into hybrid corn, we started shifting away a little bit from that checked pattern, partially because you could start mechanically harvesting corn. An open pollinated variety, all of your ears out there are not going to mature at the same time. You could have a pretty big spread. I would even tell you in some open pollinated varieties, you could have almost a 2-week spread across it because it's not homogeneous.
Sure.
Hybrid corn, when it's homogeneous, everything dries down the same. That lends itself to mechanical harvesting. But as people transitioned into mechanical harvesting and moving away from horses, you don't need to have as wide a row space, 40-inch rows, because that's how wide your horse was.
Yeah.
We don't need that anymore, so people started moving into 30-inch rows. I don't know when our farm transitioned here to 30-inch rows, but my guess is that it had to be about 1940, because I think that's when we got rid of horses.
Okay.
But at any rate, so you transition over to 30-inch rows, and folks are, instead of planting at 10,000 per acre, we're starting to creep up into that, closer to that 20,000 range. Then by the time you get to about 1980, most farmers in Iowa, I would tell you, were in 30-inch rows by then. It was very, very rarely, I think, that we had anybody that was not in 30-inch rows, and folks were planting about 28,000 at that time. So now folks are pushing not quite 40,000. We've got people that are comfortably, 36 on their farms here in Iowa. And so you have to keep that historical outlook in mind when you when you think about that USDA graph, which is it's very easy to go find that graph out there and then think about your own farm in terms of where planting rates have been and how that fits with the changes in yield across there. So it's been hand in hand, increasing populations, narrowing rows, along with these increasing yields. And so for us, that historical trend is the driver behind what we're doing in our breeding and testing today. And it's surprising to me. I've had some conversations with certain ag people at certain universities who, in one case, the guy was darn near yelling at me. It's like, how do you back this up? Where's your justification for moving to narrower rows and higher populations? Where's your data? And just, well, haven't you can go Google and get that USDA graph. And I don't know what was your dad planting on your farm when you were growing up? Just some straightforward experience.
Well, yeah, and it seems like that's one of the challenges. And somebody one point, and you kind of touched on it, was to say, okay, if you think that, when we talk to farmers today and we say, okay, here in Iowa, whatever, you may be going from 36,000 to, let's say, 40,000. And someone might say that doesn't seem logical. We shouldn't be doing that, whatever. And then you say, just like you said, well, what would your grandfather say if he said your grandson's going to plant at 36,000? Of course, they'd have you committed, and they'd say, you don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
So history is a great teacher, right? And so I think that's the hardest lesson to learn, because we get comfortable with not status quo, but we get a system that works, and then we need to always be questioning what's next, right?
Right.
So we talked about genetics and the power of the genetics, which is really the foundation of high pop corn. We talked about the planter as it becomes the cultural element of higher population planting. What are the other parts that, if growers are looking at this and saying, hey, I'm hearing a lot about this, I think I need to be really, testing populations and trying new things. So obviously factor one, genetics. Factor two, planting and harvesting. What else? Fertility. What else?
Well, I would tell people when they make that analysis, they need to be looking at about 5 years worth of data.
Okay.
Here in central Iowa, we've had a drought we're going into 2 years now. And so if you were going to base your decision on whether narrow rows work or not, based on, the data I got from the 1 year I was in a drought on my farm, you can't.
Sure.
You won't see anything there that's meaningful. So you need to look at about 5 years worth of data on your farm to actually evaluate something like this to see if it actually works. And nobody's going to want to do a 5-year experiment on their farm with buying equipment like that. But I would tell you, hey, it works. You're not going to see a home run every single year. But if you would make the switch over and look at it in terms of a 5-year span, you would see some benefits. Now, you're not necessarily going to see huge dramatic ones, but you will see that it actually indeed does work.
Well, and like we talked about earlier, the high population hybrids are stress hybrids by their nature. And so sometimes you may still get the benefit of those genetics, even if, the ideal conditions don't present themselves for maximum yield in that environment, but it may still help.
Well, and the fertility is another thing, and that's a really touchy topic this year with the fertilizer prices.
Yeah.
But I would like to point out to folks that, if you're going to move up your population, if you want to be crazy, let's say, I think we had somebody in here in Iowa, and you may have heard this story, maybe it was a co-op, that's like, oh, we're going to do a big test, and we're going to go from, 32,000 to about 40,000 and plant one of your hybrids out there. Well, you're going to have to fertilize to take care of all of those plants, do that accordingly. And I think these guys, I don't know which co-op this was, they didn't fertilize, and then they came back later and said, well, this doesn't work. Your high population corn doesn't work. Well, yeah, if you fertilize for 32,000, then put 40,000 out there, yeah, it's not going to work.
Because fertility is a function of yield, right?
Absolutely.
And so you can't test the top if you don't have the nutrients to feed it.
That's right. That's right. That just seems very common sense to me. I don't know what was going on there, but
but unfortunately, I think you run into that more often than not. I really think because you hear when this conversation comes up, you say, well, this hybrid is suited for higher populations. So whatever, grower wants to do a side by side, so we're going to do that. And we say, okay, now this one needs to be planted a little thicker. It needs a little more whatever. And they're like, well, that's not a fair comparison. I need to be comparing this to this at the same pop, at the same, nutrient level. And again, you're almost able to forecast with precision what's about to happen.
What's going to happen there. Exactly.
Because you're not treating that product the way it was designed to be treated.
That's right. That's right. That's absolutely.
So I think that's a hurdle that is still yet to overcome in a lot of these cases.
Yeah.
So earlier on in the conversation, you talked about the fact, we've seen as this high population corn initiative has sort of evolved, we've seen plant heights, continue to decrease and maybe even plateauing a little bit here.
I think our stuff is plateauing a little.
So what do you think is going to happen over the next, decade? Have we kind of we think we've seen the bottom as far as that compact plant structure, or are we just waiting to see?
I think that we are indeed at the bottom of that. Now, I would expect to possibly see changes in ear height. I don't think we're necessarily going to be shorter, but I do think that ear height should be coming up. There's data that suggests that the closer you get your tassel and your ear together, there's a yield benefit there. And as well as we know that, the top part of the plant is really the critical part of the plant for feeding that ear. So you want that ear up a little higher. But that's about the most significant change I see going forward in our own program. And I can speculate about why I think we've kind of plateaued there. And that would actually, I would take that speculation and say it has to do with the next tier of shortness that's out there involves these genes that have this shorter root system. So that doesn't mean that we won't find something that would allow us to go shorter. But I think right now we're probably there for a while.
But as we talked about, short for the sake of short is not the goal,
No,
right?
that's
and
correct.
So at the end of the day, it's about finding those hybrids that outperform the ones we have today.
Absolutely.
And in that environment. You mentioned ear height. I can't remember. Maybe it might have been a conversation with you. I don't know. But we were at one point talking about that. I think, ear height over time is kind of changed a little bit depending on who the breeders are. And I think the theory was, well, when you had corn plants that are much taller, breeders would like to get the ear height down from a standpoint of just standability and, so lodging issues.
We're going the opposite direction.
Right. So that's what I was wondering. So now as corn height is coming down, is it more about kind of letting that corn plant put the ear back where it logically wants to anyway?
Well, I'm not sure. What breeders were doing initially was, back when we were still, everybody had horses and was harvesting by hand, is you wanted that ear at a comfortable height to hand harvest.
So you could pick it by hand.
Yeah, so you could pick it by hand. Nobody wanted to bend over.
Okay.
So that was part of the driver there. But then again, we had folks that believed, well, to have a big ear, you've got to have a big plant. And so they made these huge hybrids, and ear height is, I've walked into corn plots and the ear height is at my face, and I'm 6'2". You can knock yourself unconscious walking through the plot. I think during the era of big hybrids, there was concern that, we've got these ears up too high. And so most other seed companies that have these taller hybrids are trying to bring that down. But as I told you, there are some university papers that say, oh, that's not a good thing. There appears to be a correlation between yield and moving that ear closer to that tassel. Well, we've got the flexibility, the ability to do that because we've got shorter material out there, which other people in the industry know. They're extremely tall. They're worried about the center of gravity on that hybrid being too high. So that's a lot of wild speculation there. But that's
We love wild speculation.
Well, is that good for this podcast?
Yeah.
Is that you get more listeners, or does that make listeners want to turn this off?
No, more listeners. We're going to use that actually in social media. That's
going to be the hook.
That'll be the hook that we're
bring people in.
Use. Well, Warren, thank you for being here talking to us about our high density, high population corn, the history of the corn program, and the future of HP corn. I appreciate you being here.
Well, thanks for having me, David.
Make sure to tune in 2 weeks from now. We'll be back with more expert interviews and insights from all things Stine. To make sure you never miss an episode, subscribe to the Stine Seedcast wherever podcasts are found. We'll talk to you next time. Until then, remember, Stine has yield.
Subscribe to the Stine Seedcast wherever podcasts are found. To learn more about Stine and its elite corn and soybean genetics, visit stineseed.com. Stine has yield.